I had my first exhibition in London in '63, and that was in a new gallery called the Rowan Gallery that had just opened then, so they were building a new stable of artists, and they became quite an important gallery during the 60s and 70s, showing a lot of the leading sculptors and painters of the time. But being in that show, having that show to start with, was a beginning, but I didn't think it was a particularly successful exhibition. In fact, I didn't sell a damn thing in it, and I was absolutely amazed that the lovely owners of the gallery, Alex Gregory Hood and Diana Kingsmill, they actually wrote to me after the show closed about 3 weeks later and said, "Oh, now we've got to plan your next exhibition." And I thought, because nothing sold, I thought that was it, the end of my career, no other offers of exhibitions. But they were so confident in building my future that they did that, and that was a wonderful boost, and really my entree into the world of being a professional artist. Luckily for me, Bryan Robertson, who was then the director of the Whitechapel Art Gallery, leading gallery at the time, which was bringing to London key and major exhibitions from artists, not British too, but also from America and Europe. People used to go out to Whitechapel, whereas they wouldn't ever go otherwise, to see exhibitions there. And Bryan was formulating his show called The New Generation, and he invited me to be in that show, and that was quite a launching pad for me, because it was sponsored by Stuyvesant cigarettes, and he persuaded them to give a prize, and I got it was a bit ambiguous, because Bryan was very careful to say, well, the prizes aren't hierarchical, everyone's equal who wins a prize, but Paul Huxley has won the first prize. And it was the first prize because it was sponsored a trip to America, whereas the others sponsored a trip to Europe. And so I made my first trip to America in in the summer of '64. And that was a wonderful adventure and a travel period and exploration of America and meeting extraordinary people. And so I owe that beginning to him, and the introductions he was able to forge for me.
He introduced you to a lot of the key artists at the time.
Absolutely. I mean, Robert Motherwell, who had actually been in London and visited me in the studio, talked about my work with me, wrote me a reference later on, which helped me win a Harkness scholarship, or fellowship, I should say. But other than one or two of the artists who had come to England, I met amazing artists and was welcome to stay with them. Lee Krasner, for instance, Jackson Pollock's widow, a lovely lady and a terrific artist in her own right. Underrated then. I think her status has risen gradually, and now she's got the proper respect that was due to her. She wasn't liked by a number of people in New York. She was considered to be a dragon because she protected and built Jackson Pollock's reputation and his market in his work dramatically. But she wasn't liked because she was doing that, and all the dealers and critics and so on resented her control of Pollock's work. She was a lovely woman, and really, I stayed with her several times out in Springs, where she and Jackson lived, and in New York. Stayed with the Motherwells, not only in New York, but out in Provincetown, in Cape Cod, where they had their studios, their summer studios. So that was a great adventure for me, and a real experience to make contact with artists who I only knew about by reputation. Would never dreamt in a million years that I would ever meet them.
And how much did it influence your work?
It didn't influence my work very overtly, in that I didn't make paintings that you would look at and say, oh, you obviously have known Robert Motherwell and made work that was following in his footsteps. Not at all. But I think it was turning what was in a way mythological into reality, because in those days, I'm talking about growing up as a young art student in the 1950s and eventually, making the first steps in the grown-up art world in the 1960s. In those days, I hardly knew anyone who'd been to America and come back again. It was very expensive to go there. It was a remote place. Americans came to England, first of all, as service personnel. I mean, I grew up in a place near Northolt Airport, so, you saw the cars around. But it was a remote place, and yet we grew up with American culture, didn't we? Well, you're too young to know, but we had, American pop music, American films, American writing. American culture was with us, but not the reality of it. And the same became true for me as a young artist looking at American art, particularly the mushrooming development of New York painting, the New York school. The works came across in exhibitions at the Whitechapel Art Gallery, at the Tate Gallery, at the American Embassy. It was very exciting to see them and to learn about them. But one assumed that they would remain as remote as everything else. But no, when I began to meet the artists who came to England and then to go to America and meet them, I didn't expect that. And that was, they were real people. And I could see the way they lived and the way they thought about their art. So it wasn't so much the style of their painting that influenced me so much as the excitement of entering into the real world that had fed my imagination prior to that. Mm-hmm. Going there, in the following year, you quite rightly said, because I got that fellowship, and I went to live there for just over 2 years, and I rented a loft in downtown in New York on the fringe of Chinatown, and it was a big space. I'd been working in a small Edwardian house in London and working in the biggest space that was in that house, which was like the sitting room with French windows, and I had to make that my studio, and I was trying to do large-scale painting there, but I couldn't get further back than the width of a sitting room. And then suddenly I had access to a big studio that was 100-foot long and 25-foot wide. And I could paint big scale, which is what I wanted to do. That was my ambition at the time, so I could realise my ambition and make big scale painting. And that was very, very formative in my development.
And it was also around that time that you began to sort of divide the canvas into two.
Towards the end of that time, I began to develop my paintings. Even then, I was beginning to make small-scale paintings on paper in preparation to working on a bigger scale, a habit that's lasted with me ever since. But I was making those ideas about divided canvases then. I called them, or other people called them, the key paintings, because they rather resembled maps or charts that have a key at the side of them. You know how that's something I always enjoyed as a child, you have this, you have a map and you have a little section in the corner that gives you the colours, that tells you which bits of the world belong to France and which bits belong to Britain or something like that, through colour coding. And so I began to use that device in painting, a bit like colour coding. And what I basically did was I was making paintings with big, quite brightly coloured geometric shapes in them. And then I realised that there was something I wanted to make paintings that had an outside element to them that I could bring in, so that you could read into the painting sort of alternative ideas and an alternative reading. So the first ones I did, I actually made in the way that was my custom. So perhaps 3 big geometric shapes, a square, a triangle, a circle in blue and red on a green background or whatever. Then I painted them out black, and I recorded those colours in the corner like a key. So it was a bit like saying, well, these are all black shapes, but actually if you look at the key you can see what colour they used to be. And indeed some of those colours were showing through around the edge. Then it occurred to me, well, I don't have to be honest about this. I can make other colours in the corner and not tell the truth about what those colours used to be. And so I think that's perhaps part of my nature, is to realise that you can kind of make private jokes in paintings, and they can be amusing. I know I intentionally intend my paintings to have a playful aspect to them. I don't think that's a bad thing. And also you have the opportunity to confuse people or send them off on a trail that might not be the truth. I think you can lie in paintings, and that's fair game. You can do anything you want in a painting.
I mean, and you've also worked a lot with sort of illusion and confusing people as to whether something is flat or whether there's a 3D element.
That's right. That's a good example to pick. Particularly my recent painting, I've been using ellipses a great deal. An ellipse is a geometric form. It's, unlike a circle, it has 2 centres to it, and you can draw them mechanically. I draw them with, instead of 1 point of a pair of compasses, you have 2 points, and you have to have a sort of string or wire to draw the ellipse. But it's geometric in that way. But we all know that an ellipse is what a circle looks like when it's in perspective. Like you have a circular pond, you're standing on the ground and look across the landscape, and you see it as an elliptical shape. So you draw an ellipse or paint an ellipse in a painting, and you are implying perspective. So it starts off as geometry, becomes perspective. I keep it very simple and formal, and then I put it in collision with flat areas of colour that can't be read in perspective, that are there on the surface of the painting and confronting you in a 2-dimensional planar way. And that is an example of what I've done for many years in my painting, is to put 2 things together which maybe have connections and relationships, but maybe their reason for being next to each other is a little mysterious. And so I hope to be able to invite the audience to consider what the reason is that the 2 parts are there next to each other, juxtaposed. It's sometimes possible to discover that, sometimes it remains a mystery, but that's what I like, that conundrum and the invitation to take part in unpicking the painting.
A lot of the writing about you, in fact, refers to the fact that you raise questions in your work, that it's sort of more questions and not answers.
Yes, I think that's true. And as I was just implying, I think that has to be, for me, the nature of painting. I don't think it should be dictating to the audience. I don't think it should be saying this is the way the world is, this is the way the philosophy of life should be. It should be could it be, rather than this is it.
But there is a subject matter to your work, which is unusual for abstract or abstract expressionist work.
I'm glad you said that, because what we've been discussing is a kind of subject matter. Abstract painting, in its beginnings and in its recent manifestation, has very much been a self contained idea that in making the works and in appreciating them, you shouldn't look outside. You should only take what it is they're made of. The early abstract painters called their works things like composition or abstraction or something like that. No clues. It's not about anything other than what you're looking at. And that thread has gone right through the history of abstract art to the minimalists who said what you see is what you get. In other words, there's nothing else. You have to accept that this is it, and it doesn't have outside reference. But it's a very hard and rather doubtful tenet to live by, and I think that it's in human nature to interpret and to understand. It's part of our mechanism of perception. Perception is not just eyesight, seeing like a mechanical camera. It's seeing and understanding. So our eyes are constantly trying to analyse what it is we're looking at, and if we see anything unusual or that we don't understand, it tends to draw its attention to itself, and we tend to look harder until we know what it is we're looking at. That's certainly true in the real world, and it's certainly true, I think, when you're looking at a work of art. And I think so an artist is engaging with the curiosity and the mechanism of perception of his or her public. I enjoy speculating on that aspect of it, but of course I don't know what's going on in other people's heads, but I can only use myself as a measure of maybe that's the way things work.
So you don't see your works as having a specific meaning or message. It's down to the audience, the viewers, to interpret as they will?
Not a meaning or message, but that doesn't preclude subject matter, because I think subject matter can be to do with what we've just been discussing, the conundrum of what is presented in the painting and understanding what the interaction of the parts may be. I've gone a little bit further at various phases of my paintings, and something a bit more tangible as subject matter has come into them, but it's not meant to interfere with the pureness of looking at colour and form and responding to the interaction between the parts, and I hope enjoying that aspect of it. For instance, I did a series of paintings that had Chinese characters in them. I don't read or speak Chinese, so when I went to China, there were these forms in the public signage which I loved looking at because they looked like my paintings. I didn't know what they said or meant, but I adopted them and incorporated them into my paintings. More recently, in Venice, I did a series of paintings on the wall in a room that referred to climate change. I don't think it was essential to know. There the paintings did have a meaning, but I don't think it was essential to know that meaning to enjoy the paintings. But there was also the meaning there, if anyone wanted to penetrate that little bit further. And that interested me to do a great deal.
That was working with charts and percentages. And
working with, yes, charts. That's a good word, because some of my early paintings did look a bit like charts. I used sequences of shapes within a painting, and some of them increased in size or form as they moved across one after another across the surface of a painting, from one corner to another or from one side to another. And when you do that with shapes, they could be interpreted as being like a graph on a wall, you know, that things are rising or declining or evolving in some way, metamorphizing. And with that as part of my vocabulary of painting, it occurred to me that I could use factual statistics. In other words, turn it on its head, use the statistics and build them into the structure of the painting, and that's what I did. Those paintings have turned into real paintings on canvas as opposed to on wall, and paintings that are more out of touch with their reason for being painted in the first place and becoming more in the mainstream of my work. And they're going to be part of the exhibition I'm having shortly in Santa Fe in New Mexico.
Okay.
Yes.
So for that show you've got 12 canvases and 3 sculptures.
Correct, yes.
Is sculpture something relatively new for you?
It is. I wasn't trained as a sculptor and never made any sculpture until about 5 or 6 years ago, when I began making some maquettes, small versions of what might be larger sculptures. I was familiar with that way of working because that's the way I work in my paintings now. I make small studies, I develop them to a slightly larger size on paper, and they are plans for the bigger paintings. And it's a fairly common practice for sculptors to make a smaller version, due to pure practicality, of course, and then they can work things out and make the final bigger version later. That's what I did, with a bit of a commission dangling in front of me that somebody was interested in a big scale out-of-door sculpture. So I made maquettes. They were easy for me to make and very enjoyable because I was really making objects that had their roots in my painting. I evolved over the years a vocabulary of forms and games in painting, of things balancing on one another, things touching by a pinpoint, and I could start making them real. Something I'd always avoided doing because I believed in the illusion in painting. So I made these, and then I had to think about, well, what size the finished one's going to be. Then I realised, hang on, this is the problem that sculptors have to face, which we do in painting all the time, and I'm used to that, but I couldn't quite, had to think about things. Well, if I make is there a difference between an indoor sculpture and an outdoor sculpture? And if it's an indoor sculpture, how big can it be before you can't get it through a doorway? Things like that. So I came to a bit of a standstill, and then I've moved on with them and developed them, and I've made some I think very interesting work. It's had a good reception so far in England, in that they're a slightly odd size. They're a bit big for tabletop sculpture and a bit small for outdoor sculpture, so they hover in a world that's not a very sculptural world, but very close to my paintings. And people say immediately, oh, they're exactly like your paintings. So I'm excited to have done them. These are my little toys. So I started to try to do the impossible, which you can do in a painting, but you can't do with wood and steel, and that's to balance things on points. This one, for instance.
How are they held?
By magic. I think I've got a pin going through there, you see. And so I had to communicate with the fabricators in Glasgow that how are you going to fix that disc to that point? I want it to look as minimal as possible so that it looks like it's balancing and about to fall in a precarious way. Then I'm going to develop these where I've got a sphere balancing on a point. I don't know if it can be made. I can make it up to a level on a small scale out of light materials, but whether that can be done
in steel?
In steel, I don't know. It should be able to, because, they're structured in a way. I can imagine exactly how they should all fit together and be fabricated.
So are you a 3D convert now?
No, not entirely. You know what? I have probably more fun making sculpture than making paintings, but I've made paintings all my life, and that's my serious work. I don't know what people mean when they say they enjoy painting. I mean, or that they find it relaxing. I listen to the radio sometimes and I hear an actor or a politician or something being interviewed, and they say, "Oh, well, what I love to do is to paint because it's so relaxing." And I'm here in my studio, I think, it's bloody well not relaxing, it's giving me pain and anxiety and struggle. It's hard work. And in no way would it relax me, because it's something you're trying to do that's difficult. And I can only imagine that they're not challenging themselves, they're just playing. Yeah. But perhaps because I don't see myself as a sculptor, I feel that when I make sculpture I can play. Probably my friends and colleagues who are sculptors probably look on this with great disdain, but they're kind to me, they're polite, they don't say anything, they smile and say, "Well done." Well, this gives an idea about how I work. Some little trick that I've learnt over the years is it's very good to make little models, and obviously that has to be done if one's preparing to do a wall drawing on a bigger scale, so you need the architecture very precise. But I've also found that when I'm having an exhibition, it's rather good to have a floor plan of the gallery and get an idea. This is not a miniature hang necessarily. The gallery people will know how they want it, and I'll probably interfere more than they want me to. But anyway, it gives me an idea in advance what the space will be like, how many works I'll need to make an exhibition out of it. And so this is the floor plan of the Santa Fe exhibition. These are just fridge magnets to replicate where I'm going to have these tabletop sculptures, and these are the paintings which will be hanging in the exhibition. But what we want to do, because we've been talking about it earlier. Oh, I ought to just mention this is the wall drawing I did in Venice, and this is the exact scale of the room, which was in a wonderful 13th century palazzo overlooking the Grand Canal. This window is actually where Canaletto worked and painted his largest picture of the Rialto Bridge looking up the Grand Canal. So it was very exciting to be in that building. It's all lopsided. You can see it's not a proper square room. It's not even a parallelogram, I don't think, and that's true of the floors and ceilings, which all slope. You can feel yourself walking. I put a jar of paint with a screwed lid on the floor and just put it on the floor, and it rolled away down to the other end of the room. So it just shows that Venice is literally sinking as the water's rising. So that was a very exciting project that I was doing in April and May this year, 2015. And I'm just going to park that up there. So this is a tabletop that gives you an idea about how I work. I was talking about doing things a bit like sculptors' maquettes, and basically I draw to begin with on this sort of scale, and I make little pen drawings on small bits of paper, and I evolve ideas like that. And I work a bit in the way that traditionally in the old days graphic designers used to work before they had computers, and what they used to do, and I do a simple method where you tuck your drawing underneath the first page of a pad. You can see it coming through as a ghost, and then you can make the changes you want to make to improve your idea. And then once you've done that one, you tear that off and you tuck it under the next page, and what you end up with is a sequence. These are all mixed up. You can see some of them are similar. and you get a sequence of drawings, one after the other, and I'm not going to be able to find the right ones for the sequence, but they end up being a little bit like the frames of an animated film. And it not only shows an evolution of the idea, but possible stopping points where they could become paintings. So then colour has to come into it, and then I start working on a bigger scale, which is what I was up to here. This is a classic way for me to work. I always make my first paintings on this scale on paper, and this is where mistakes are made, and I can use collage if I want to. I can change colours and make a mess and then refine them and get down to the fine details, all the time developing an idea about what sort of size I want the canvases eventually to be. And so these are like a sculptor's maquette for a bigger work. I stretch the paper, make it damp, stretch it, fix it down, and so the paper's nice and taut and it doesn't wrinkle when I put the paint on.
And we can see your ellipses there as well.
Yes.
It really does look like there's kind of this space, like they are 3D going backwards, that middle row.
It does, and I think at one point we were talking about my evolution of, or my vocabulary of forms and ideas, and funnily enough, I made a painting that was in that Whitechapel show, The New Generation, back in 64 or something like that, with a big elliptical form like that, low down in the painting. And then I never used that shape again really after that time until very recently, and it came back into my painting again. I suddenly realised that, hang on, I've been doing this before, but this time around with a great deal more precision. In those days I painted it freehand and sat there and thought, no, that's a bit crooked, and kind of tried to modify the edges and redraw it and so on. It never occurred to me to do it in a physical, mechanical way with, you know, the structure of the two centres and so on. And now I like to get them precise looking, and that's what I do. But there's a whole history of my work on this scale in my planchette drawers. I can show you here if we move across the studio to my planchette. Probably lots of bits of clean paper here that I haven't worked on yet, but so we go back in through other. There's a study, you could call it, for the painting that's over there. This came after the wall drawing in Venice, but it's a painting that developed from that.
So these drawings or paintings, do you consider these to be works in their own right, or are they all purely studies?
That's a good question. It certainly works in their own right, absolutely, yes. And I have exhibited them sometimes, but actually what I'd really like to do is keep them for myself. Because, you know, the paintings go out there in the world, and they sometimes, if you're lucky, get sold and owned by other people, and they take off, like losing your children, and they're going off into the world. But it's nice to have a physical record of them. And it's, Turner kept a collection of his works in the form of engravings, and it's rather like that.